Let me fix this over here. Get our music fixed over here. I think it's going to be way too loud. It always is. There we go. Fix this. How you doing? I know we just got off from the yogurt shops, but this is another case where we need to talk about, did Texas get it wrong? Because, it's another death row case. It's overturned. They used what's called junk science. If you're not familiar, we're going to discuss that as well. Anyway, good to see you here. While we wait on a couple folks to come on in, I'm going to go ahead and let just a little bit of music play while I grab my other utensils, my other earphones, etc. So hang on just a second, guys. Let's just listen to a little music here. Hang on. Thank you for coming in. We always appreciate it.
Clean in a GL whip, Kenny Red Flash with a turbo kick. Lil Laredo, yeah, the name's on fire. Burning up the road, taking dreams higher. 0 to 100, no time to stall. Every frame, every post, yeah, he does it all. From the streets to the screen, he's got that glow. Welcome to the ride, it's Lil Laredo. Red line dreams, we don't slow down. Engine roar when we hit your town. Missing stars so sharp like a midnight show. Oh gas, no brakes, little no. Gas, no brakes, little no. Drift through life with a fearless tone. Every move custom, every vibe is on. Not just a car, it's a way of life. Precision, passion, cutting like a knife. Headlights blaze through the doubt and fear. He's the one they watch, the one they cheer. So buckle up tight, let the legend grow. You're in the fast lane with Lil Laredo.
Turn down, get ourselves back together here. We are ready to go with our show. So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our previous show to talk about, did Texas get it wrong? Because Texas gets it wrong quite a bit, it looks like. And it's unreasonable the amount of time that they get it wrong, I think. But, I know a lot of this is old cases and new information and just things like that. Let me get this off of the screen right quick. Get that off of there so we can get back on. And here we go. Let's go live. Let's talk about it. Did Texas use junk science to convict someone? The guy's name is Robert Roberson. So he is a separate, high-profile Texas death row case that involves shaken baby syndrome. Now, there has been significant legislative efforts to overturn his conviction, but his case is unrelated to the yogurt shop. It has nothing to do with it. It's just another case of, did they get it wrong? Now, we're going to talk about shaken baby syndrome. We've seen a lot of babies and we're like, oh no, it's shaken baby syndrome. And we're going to talk about little Emmanuel Haro. Same thing. Remember how he looked? And all of us, the first thing we said was shaken baby syndrome. Okay. So we're going to look at Robert Roberson. Okay. And I have his appeal and I have a bunch of information on his case. But we're going to start with the actual case itself. When did it happen? Why did it happen? And who decided that he shook his baby? Right? Who made that decision? Is it just somebody said so? How did this happen? Let's go back to the very beginning. Okay. Let's see. Here's the case background. It's important to have a little bit of the case background so you understand the brief that we're going to read. Roberson was convicted of killing his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki, based on a diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome. His defense argues that new science, the scientific understanding of shaken baby syndrome, has changed significantly since 2003 when this case happened. I hope we can hear everything. Okay, let me check the sound over here. You know, sometimes it's an issue sometimes with okay. Yeah, we're good. All right, I think we're good. Anyway, so they said back in 2003 that she likely died from complications of severe pneumonia and accidental falls. Autism. Roberson later was diagnosed with autism, which explains the flat emotional demeanor that investigators originally interpreted as a sign of guilt. You cannot decide somebody's guilty just because of the way they look or because they seem flat. See? Oh, that's not even fair. Legal precedents. His attorneys cite the cases of Andrew Work, whose SBS-related conviction was recently overturned as a reason for Roberson to receive a new trial. They're not trying to say he didn't do anything at all. They just want to get a fair trial and not use junk science to convict someone. Okay? So here we go. We're going to start with, this was filed in Texas, and it is the capital case against Robert Leslie Roberson III. So this is his application to extend time to file a petition for a writ of certiorari from April 11th to June 7th. Okay, so this is a little back, but it'll bring it up to what's going on in the case today. So, and this is what I truly enjoy on my channel. So talk about, you know, these cases and the appeals process and what really happened, and, you know, is what we see the facts, not the facts, or somewhere in between. So here we go. To the Honorable Samuel A. Alito, Jr., pursuant to 28 U.S.C. 2101 and Supreme Court rules, I'm going to skip the citings on these because we would be reading all day if we read every single citing. So, the petitioner, Robert Leslie Roberson III, respectfully requests that the time to file a petition for a writ of certiorari be extended by 45 days from April the 11th and including June 7th. Now, we're going to go back. On January the 11th, 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, CCA, issued per curiam an order denying petitioner's application for writ of habeas corpus. There is an Exhibit A and there is an Exhibit B. I wish I could pull up. Well, maybe let me see if we can get Exhibit A to show up over here because it's in my file. So hang on just a second. Let's try to get it on the so you can see it. Okay, let's see Exhibit A. Here we go. Don't you bark, buddy. Okay, let's see. Okay, come on. Yes, it is in there. We put it in there yesterday, silly. Here we go. Okay. It was a download. Let me see. We might or might not be able to get it to pull up over here. I am looking on my iPad and the Windows. Your laptop does. Oh, wait a minute. No, that's okay. We're not going to be able to pull it up over here. That's okay, too. We'll just keep talking. It's fine. So there's an Exhibit A and Exhibit B. And Exhibit A was absence and extension. The petition would be due on April the 11th. This application is being filed at least 10 days before the date, and then it gives the citing. The jurisdiction of this court would be invoked under 28 U.S.C. to review this case. Basic background, and this is where we're going all the way back. Petitioner is on Texas death row in the custody of the warden at the Allen B. Polinsky Unit State Prison in Livingston, Texas. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death in February of 2003. So this is a 20-year-old case that we're dealing with. After taking his comatose daughter to the emergency room on January the 31st, the conviction relied on testimony from emergency rooms on January the 31st, medical doctors, and what could and could not have caused the child's death. The consensus of the state's experts was that her death was explained by shaken baby syndrome, or SBS, also known as shaken impact syndrome, and subsequently recharacterized as an abusive head trauma. Which one is it? All right. The CCA ultimately affirmed that the conviction and sentence describing at length the SBS causation and the testimony that had been adduced at trial Roberson versus State, number AP 74671 of the Texas Criminal Appeals, blah, blah. The CCA later denied all relief requested in an initial state habeas application and dismissed a 2005 pro se filing as an unauthorized successive application of ex parte. Roberson, and it gives, the writs, and then the case numbers. Neither petitioner appointed trial or state habeas counsel challenged the SBS causation, which defense counsel had conceded on the record throughout trial was the only explanation for the child's death, despite his client's insistence on his innocence. State's habeas counsel continued to represent petitioner in the federal habeas proceedings, but never revisited the state's SBS causation theory. Okay. In 2016, to me, it sounds already like his trial attorney is not even doing his job. It starts out wrong. Okay. In 2016, with an execution date pending, the current proceeding was initiated focusing on intervening and changing in the scientific, because of the changes in the scientific understanding of SBS. The subsequent habeas application relied on a new procedural vehicle enacted by Texas legislature specifically to address convictions based on subsequently discredited or changed scientific understanding, junk science, as SBS. This is what they're going to talk about. There are 4 claims that were raised. Number 1, the new scientific evidence established by a preponderance of the evidence that the petitioner would not have been convicted. The state's reliance on false, misleading, or significantly invalid testimony had deprived the petitioner of the right to due process under the law. The petitioner was entitled to habeas relief because he is actually innocent. We know they all say they're innocent, but we know they're not all innocent, right? Okay. And number 4, that the petitioner was entitled to habeas relief because his federal rights to due process. And then, let me turn this music down. To me, it seems loud. I don't know what y'all are hearing, but to me, it just seems loud. Let's see. Well, no, it's not very loud. Okay, we'll just turn it off. We don't need it because I'm not using anybody else's information. Okay, now that's better. Okay. So let's see, go back to where I was before I turn that down. Okay. So number 4, that the petitioner was entitled to habeas relief because his federal rights to due process and fair trial were violated by the state's introduction of forensic science testimony that current science has exposed as false. The application, supported by several volumes of evidentiary proffers, was submitted to the CCA, along with a motion seeking the stay and the pending execution. He is on death's door when this is going on, days before he was to be executed. On June 16th of 2016, the CCA granted the motion to stay the execution and entered an order remanding all 4 of Robert's claims to the trial court for resolution, which is in Exhibit B, which I cannot show you because it's not on my laptop. It is on my iPad, which they don't work together. So anyway, it's Mac versus Windows. Okay, so during a 9-day evidentiary hearing, 11 volumes of new evidence was amassed, including thousands of pages of scientific articles and treatises. Most importantly, substantial new evidence regarding the natural and accidental factors that explain the child's death was addressed. This was evidence supporting petitioner's claim of actual innocence that had not been available to him when the subsequent state habeas proceeding was initiated back in June of 2016. Therefore, the parties submitted proposed findings of fact and conclusions of law. The FFCL that the convicting court ultimately submitted to the CCA, recommending that the relief be denied. So now they're going to say, well, no, we're not going to listen to you. But why? He has new evidence. He has new information about shaken baby syndrome. Then he goes with, including its typographical and grammatical errors. Whoa, errors in the paperwork, grammatically and typographically. They did not mention any of the new science evidence challenging the validity of the SBS or the new evidence that the child's death had been caused by natural and accidental causes, not an inflicted injury. On January the 11th, the CCA issued an unsigned 2-page opinion adopting the convicting court's proposed FFCL as its own and summarily denying a new trial. Now, this is kind of important because I want y'all to think back about how many other people have been sentenced sent to prison over what's called shaken baby syndrome prior to the new information coming about SBS. I want to know how many other people are sitting in jail right now for the same thing that maybe deserve a new trial. Okay, so here we go. Reasons for granting an extension of time. Extending the time available to file a petition for writ of certiorari is appropriate for at least 4 distinct reasons. First, because petitioner is indigent, he will rely on the assistance of an undersigned counsel to develop and present his petition. Unsigned counsel is also a solo petitioner appointed by the habeas in 2018 to continue her representation of the petitioner, which had begun in 2016 while she was employed as a state capitol habeas public defender. There's also an Exhibit C. Okay. Since the proceedings before the convicting court ended in February the 14th on 2022, counsel has been providing representation on a pro bono basis. The undersigned is thus otherwise engaged in the practice of law to earn a living. The practice includes representing other individuals in capital post-conviction proceedings and the clients in civil matters. A brief for one such client is currently due in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals on April 17th. See Heath versus RPM Dining. Okay. In another matter, the direct appeal and the death penalty case, the state's response brief is due April 27th, 2023, making the undersigned reply brief for her client due on May 13th. There's this window of time that one files, they get a copy, and then the other one files. That's kind of how it works. So, second, the factual predicate for the anticipated petition is dense, complex, and disturbing as it involves chronically ill child who died at age 2 and a controversial medical hypothesis known as SBS, the history of which is central to the habeas claims. The SBS medical diagnosis has been subjected to a great deal of debate since the petitioner's 2003 trial. In light of evolving scientific inquiry into its basic tenets, additional time will enable counsel to prepare a well-researched and yet accessible petition that will be of maximum benefit to this court. And third, no execution date is pending, and regardless of whether the extension is granted, the petition will not be considered until next term. So they're gonna get it all submitted, and then they got to sit and wait for a while. Moreover, if the petition were granted, it would be argued that in the next term, therefore, no, sorry, buddy. The extension will not likely substantially delay resolution of this case or prejudice of any party. And number 4, and most critically, petitioner will be seeking a summary reversal, which the court is likely to grant. The petition will raise significant concerns about the CCA's failure to adhere to the U.S. Constitution with regards to petitioner's due process. That's the same argument as the other one. The proceedings below was expressly authorized so that the factual record could be expanded to enable reconsideration of the suspect's scientific causation. This was used to obtain the petitioner's conviction back in 2003. And yet the Texas courts below disregarded substantial, unrebutted new evidence of change in scientific understanding since 2003, which has destabilized each of the tenets of the SBS causation theory once accepted as medical orthodoxy. So it's been looked at many times, and medical field says, okay, yeah, this is what we think now. The Texas courts also disregarded the substantial, the Texas courts also disregarded substantial, unrebutted evidence of the natural and accidental causes of the death at issue in this case, which established petitioner's innocence. Relief was denied in an unsigned 2-page order without explanation or reference to any of the voluminous new evidence that the hypothesis used to obtain their conviction. It was false, misleading, and unreliable, and that a contemporary scientific and medical injury has identified natural and accidental causes that explain the tragic death of the petitioner's child. Thus, the due process violation associated with the conviction based on subsequently discredited science was compounded by deprivation of due process in this post-conviction proceeding, which was expressly authorized to address the change in scientific understanding. The conviction should have been vacated and a new trial authorized. The stakes warrant the extension of the request. I'm sure it does take a long time. In conclusion, for the foregoing reason, petitioner respectfully asks that the time of filing petition for writ of certiorari in this matter be extended. So that was the first thing that happened on this brief. All right, here we go. We're going to go to the next part of this, of what happened here. Come on. So that was the first part. Then, and this is over here, in the Supreme Court of Texas, and this is the writ of certiorari, okay? And this is to the Court of Criminal Appeals. All right, let's go. I'm not going to read all the little preceding where they describe every little citing that they're going to make. So here we go. Let's go down to the first page. In interest of amicus curiae, Witness to Innocence is a nonprofit organization of exonerated death row inmates and their loved ones. Through public speaking, testifying in state legislatures, media work, and active participation in the nation's cultural life, its members educate the public about wrongful convictions. WTI also provides a network of peer support for the exonerated, most of whom receive no compensation. Okay, it's important that you be exonerated or else you don't get the compensation. That's exactly why they had the hearing today on the murders, the yogurt murder shops, or the yogurt shop murders in Austin today. Okay, so it is particularly concerned with the case because its members have been personally affected by persuasive problems involving unreliable forensic evidence and its application in courtrooms across the country. WTI advocates for the reforms to prevent wrongful convictions and has a strong interest in ensuring that scientific evidence and interest directly implicated by petitioner for Roberson's case. Okay, so here's the summary of their argument, and this is where it's going to really begin. When a tragedy occurs, people want to know why. They want to make sense of suffering and death. That is especially true when the victim is an infant. The hypothesis that shaking can fatally injure a baby, later termed as shaken baby syndrome or SBS, was doctors' attempt to explain why infants with no external signs of trauma were showing up in hospitals with 3 symptoms collectively known as SBS triad: bleeding in the head area, between the brain and the skull. This is kind of, okay, so it's kind of graphical, so we're going to give a warning here about, yeah. Hey, Sprinkle, good to see you. Okay, so we're going to go back to, I lost my place for a second. Sorry, guys. They don't have external signs, so they have this head thing. Then the next thing that happens is you'll see subdural hemorrhages, brain swelling, cerebral edema, and bleeding behind the eyes, and the retinal hemorrhages. According to the SBS hypothesis, absent a high-speed vehicle crash or a fall from a significant height, this constellation of injuries could be caused only by violent shaking inflicted by the person who had physical custody of the child at the time the symptoms arose. Here's the problem with this, though. Even if this child was shaken and nobody saw him do it, could he have been left in the care of this child by somebody else who actually did the shaking? That's part of the problems with some of these things. So the SBS hypothesis provided prosecutors with a straightforward causal explanation and a clear perpetrator. Since the 1970s, prosecutors have used SBS to charge over 3,000 people. Think about this statement: 3,000 people with abuse or murder, most of them caregivers or parents like the petitioner who was convicted for the death of his 2-year-old daughter, Nikki. And it gives you see the matters of Matthew Clark, Shakes baby syndrome diagnosis, which is something maybe we should look at later. However, over the past 2 decades, scientific research has revealed that the symptoms associated with SBS can be caused by other means. Oh, Sprinkle, I forgot to, let me look at something. Oh, you're not off today, are you? It's Thursday. Are you off today, Sprinkled? If you are, jump on up here. I didn't know. I think you told me you had changed your days off, or what? I couldn't remember. So if you are, just let me know. I'll send you the link. Or did I send you the link? Let me see. Hang on a minute, girl. Let me get you this link sent over so you can come on up and talk about this. It is horrific. 3,000 other people. That's a lot of people convicted with junk science, as they called it. All right, hang on a second. Let me pull this up for you. I thought I had put this on yesterday, but when I went to get it, I couldn't find it. Okay. Invite the guest. Copy. I think this is it. If it doesn't let you on, let me know, okay? Well, I'll know because you won't pop up. Here we go. Okay, here we go. Paste. There. All right, there you go. If you're at home, yeah. Yeah, well, then come on. I thought you were. I wasn't sure though. Well, there you go. I sent you that link. Come on up. Oh, I gotta find my place again now. See, I get all sidetracked. Okay, there we go. So then we come down to um, okay. So the hypothesis provided prosecutors with straightforward, that explanation. And there's been 3,000 people since the 1970s. Okay. However, over the past 2 decades, scientific research has revealed that the symptoms associated with SBS can also be caused by other means. Here we go. Let me get you on here. Let's go. Let's go. Here we go. There you are. Okay, good. Glad to see you this morning. Thank you for coming in.
Good morning.
Yeah, what time is it there? Oh, it's 10 o'clock or so. Okay. All right, let me get back where I
10:30,
was.
yeah.
I lost my place again. Okay, so however, decades ago, they researched that revealed the symptoms associated with this could be caused by other means, including, for example, shortfalls, underlying medical issues, uh, and associated with oxygen deprivation. So when you can't breathe, it can cause your eyes to hemorrhage. We know that by choking victims, right? That's part of a choking victim. So that's what they show. So consequently, SBS has come under increased scrutiny by medical experts. And of course, due to the lack of scientific proof behind the hypothesis, scientific advancements regarding SBS have allowed numerous individuals to mount successful challenges to their convictions, often only after having spent years or decades in prison or even on death row. Their struggles, like those of people wrongly convicted based on other unreliable forensic theories, illustrate the human toll of uncritical acceptance of plausible sounding scientific theories. WTI submits that this brief to tell the stories of some of these SBS exonerees. Like the petitioner, they are representatives of the double tragedy that has befallen many parents and caregivers who not only had a child in their case suffer injury, illness, or death, but also were wrongly convicted and harming of their own child. I think this is good. Okay, so we're going to move on up to the actual argument. Now, this is a 28-page document. So it's going to take a little bit of time, but that's okay. We'll get through it. Widely disputed scientific theories, such as SBS, have resulted in a high number of wrongful convictions. That's why it's called junk science. Throughout the U.S., criminal justice system scientific theories in the form of forensic evidence often plays a critical role in criminal prosecutions. While some have been carefully developed, rigorously tested, and corroborated by the scientific community, others have often, I wish that would go away. Things are popping on my iPad here. Okay, so it comes back over here. Others often, because of their intuition plausibility, despite the fact that they have not been tested or proven. Indeed, some theories remain hotly debated in scientific and medical communities, yet they're presented as facts by prosecutors and expert witnesses in support of a criminal conviction. One such example of SBS. Unreliable forensic theories typically have several common attributes, including being supported by limited or no scientific evidence or research. Number two, being presented as a conclusive with no acknowledgement of error rates. And number three, relying on subjective criteria or interpretations. And number four, oversimplifying complex science. And then it gives a whole bunch of sightings of different people, that there are other cases they're looking at here. It is often the case that despite limited supporting evidence and medical uncertainty, unreliable forensic evidence becomes widely accepted in the courts, resulting in countless criminal convictions. And then it cites some more. So there's actually something called Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, a path forward. And this is something I think that if we read it, it might talk about this exact junk science. Okay. It is often the case that despite limited supporting evidence and medical, uncertainty, and it talks about this. Let's go back down. This is kind of hard to see right there. All right. Okay. Some cases, substantive information and testimony based on faulty forensic science analysis may have contributed to wrongful convictions of innocent people. This fact has demonstrated that the potential danger of giving undue weight to evidence and testimony derived from imperfect testing analysis. I've always kind of thought, and you might think the same thing, Sprinkle, I don't know. I know we really haven't talked about this, but I've always kind of thought that just terming every child you see that looks like they've had shaky baby syndrome, they may not really have been shaken. We talk about the little Haro child. Was he shaken? We don't know, you know. If they come from a family where you've got a lot of child abuse, it's more likely possible, but they don't have proof that that's what happened, especially when you don't even have the little body of that baby, which is so sad. It's a really sad case. So it is very possible that half of the people that's been convicted are absolutely innocent. That's what I'm going to say. At this point, I see it as 50-50. Consider the trajectory of the bloodstain pattern analysis, a form of unreliable forensic evidence that purports to reconstruct a crime scene by analyzing the bloodstains left behind. See, I've always questioned blood patterns too, because how do they know? I mean, you can recreate things all the time, but it does not mean it's going to be accurate, right? It's called recreation for a reason. You weren't there and you had to try to prove that that's what happened. So, California. Okay, in 1957, the Supreme Court of California first determined to be admitted at trial the theory that then gained widespread acceptance through our legal system during the 1980s and 1990s. And it gives their citing. However, bloodstain pattern analysis was untested. Even though it was not developed in an accredited lab, nor peer-reviewed or rigorously assessed in a large-scale study, it went largely unchallenged for decades. And then there's some more sightings. In recent years, the theory has been called into question, resulting in numerous long overdue exonerations. The reason why this is 28 pages is because there's a lot of sightings here. Bloodstain patterns analysis is just one example of the dangers of unreliable forensic evidence. Many widely accepted forensic techniques have recently been called into question by scientific and medical experts, including bite mark evidence, firearm matching, and hair and fiber evidence. Okay, let's stop and talk about, mark my place there. We're going to stop and talk about bite mark evidence. Bite mark evidence is one of the hardest ones to prove, but how many cases have we heard of where they use bite marks? Oh yeah, that's a bite mark. We are guilty of some of the same sort of a thing in a case that's active right now in a missing child. A lot of people, I don't really like to talk about this case, but it gives you something to think about here. A lot of people have seen this one particular picture and claimed, even my husband, who only saw one picture, sadly, said that looks like human bite marks. And it was on the arm of a stepfather of a missing child. So think about that for a second. That's how quickly a person's mind, he knows nothing about this case, nothing. I show him a picture, he goes, oh, that looks like human bite marks. That's how quickly the mind runs to the bite marks. When left unchecked, dubious forensic evidence can result in wrongful convictions and ultimately undermine the goals of the U.S. criminal justice system. To counteract the risk of wrongful convictions, some jurisdictions have enacted laws that provide legal avenues to challenge convictions based on dubious forensic evidence. In 2013, Texas became one of the first states to enact such a law. The very law through which petitioners sought relief below, it's Article 11 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedures, known as the junk science writ. This is junk science writ. Allows individuals to seek a post-conviction habeas relief where their conviction was based on forensic evidence that has been undermined by new research. Although Texas' junk science writ has resulted in new trials or acquittals, justice has not always been served, as in the petitioner's case demonstrates. Although the SBS hypothesis presents many of the hallmarks of unreliable forensic evidence, and although reconsideration has resulted in numerous exonerations throughout the country, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals hastily dismissed the petitioner's claim in a 3-page opinion. But a review of some of the numerous exonerations in the cases grounded in SBS shows why petitioner's case demands more research and more reviews. Indeed, members of this court cast doubt on the use of the SBS hypothesis in the courtroom nearly 12 years ago, highlighting the need for increased scrutiny. In Cabeas I'm saying that wrong, Cavias versus Smith, which concerned a grandmother's assault conviction based on SBS, Justice Ginsburg authored a dissent joined by Justice Breyer and Sotomayor, noting that doubt has increased in the medical community over whether infants can be fatally injured through shaking alone. And there's a whole bunch of sightings on that. Okay. Justice Ginsburg highlighted the shift in medical acceptance of SBS hypotheses, observing that in light of the current information, it is unlikely that the prosecution's experts would today testify as adamantly as they did in 1997. What is now known about SBS hypotheses, Justice Ginsburg says, seems to me worthy of considerable weight in the discretionary decisions whether to take up this tragic case. Okay. An analysis of SBS wrongful conviction illustrates that such cases are often predicated on fallacies that send innocent individuals to prison, or in egregious cases like petitioners may send them to their death. As Justice Ginsburg explained, those flaws warrant considerable weight in deciding whether to grant a review. Then it goes down to number B. It talks about the debunking of this, junk science. The debunked belief that medical conditions cannot cause SBS symptoms has led to wrongful convictions. Well, there's 3,000 of them, actually. They're saying 3,000 people have been convicted of this. One of the primary dangers of disputed forensic evidence is the controversial conclusions are accepted as fact. As a result, jurors may reject alternative explanations. This is exaggerated, certainly, and it has been persuasive problems with the SBS hypothesis, because the SBS hypothesis maintains that the triad of symptoms could have only been caused by a caregiver's abuse. Medical experts, investigators, and prosecutors are quick to reject alternative explanations. Early medical consensus on SBS, particularly in the years before the petitioner's 2003 conviction, held that the constellation of injuries associated with SBS could not result from underlying medical conditions. Accordingly, when the symptoms triad was present, the idea that the injuries could have been caused by an illness was hastily dismissed. This is particularly true where other fallacies or assumptions associated with SBS were present, including where the infant had external injuries that were, skip on down, mistaken for abuse, but often caused by life-saving measures such as CPR, or where the caregiver reacted in a way investigators or prosecutors deemed inappropriate. And it gives a bunch of sightings. Now, medical experts agree that the constellation of injuries associated with SBS actually can be caused by a number of medical conditions. Let's talk about medical conditions for a minute. I mean, high fever. What can a high fever do to a child? What if a child is having a seizure and it bumps its head? Right there, I mean, you're going to get some of those same injuries that SBS would present. Could a child have no history of a seizure, all of a sudden have a seizure, you take her to the emergency room, and then guess what? You're being charged with SBS? Absolutely. Absolutely. It can happen. So, back to where we were. Unfortunately, at the time of his 2003 trial, petitioner did not have the benefit of research linking the SBS symptoms to medical conditions. Even if he had, the SBS hypothesis was then so widely accepted that it left little room for alternative explanations. In many SBS cases, like the petitioner's, the presence of the symptoms triad resulted in a rush to judgment that made it effectively impossible to propose an alternate explanation. Several exonerations highlight how uncritical acceptance of SBS resulted in a failure to explore medical conditions that could cause the same triad. My eyes twitching. Julie Balmer, this is another one. Julie Balmer. She was convicted of first-degree child abuse by Michigan jury in 2003 for severe injuries of her 6-week-old nephew, Philip, and it gives the National Registry name. Philip's mother, Victoria, experienced a difficult delivery, which resulted in Philip spending his first week in the newborn intensive care unit. People versus Banner gives it cites the case itself. Victoria suffered from drug addiction and gave Philip to her sister, Julie, to raise. In October of 2003, Julie Balmer brought her nephew to the emergency room with complaints that he was fussy and refused to eat. An attending physician noted that Philip was in a coma, severely dehydrated, hypoglycemic, and it was in kidney failure and anemic. A CT scan revealed subdural bleeding and a skull fracture. Although the fracture was not near the site of the hemorrhage, National Registry Exonerations, Julie Balmer, Philip also had retinal bleeding. All the symptoms that first thing they're going to holler is SBS. Sad, huh?
Yeah, but with
Yeah,
SBF you don't get a skull fracture.
right. But something happened to this child. But what if it wasn't
Yeah, something
SBS?
definitely happened, but it wasn't SBS because you don't get a skull fracture from that.
The fact that this child was born to an addicted mother and he spent a long time in the NIC unit because he was probably born addicted as well. He might have had an unknown seizure problem and then had a seizure one day and boom, because he was so little, he's good. I don't know. I'm
Hmm.
just guessing that's one of the things that could have happened. I'm not sure.
Right, right.
Medical specialists determined that the injuries were inflicted 12 to 48 hours before Philip's arrival at the hospital. A radiologist concluded that Philip's injuries were best explained by blunt force trauma and shaking. Okay, well, you can bump your head and shake in the middle of a seizure. I have had a grand mal seizure 2 times, and I'm going to tell you what, you feel like a damn train ran over you after the fact. Okay, so it's pretty violent. It is a violent reaction
Hmm.
or a violent action. Let me just say violent action.
Right, right.
Um, And then it says, although Philip survived, he was disabled. Emily Bazelon, another shaken baby syndrome, faces new questions in court. 2 doctors from Philip's treating hospital testified that his injury stemmed from either shaking or blunt force trauma, likely inflicted within 12 to 24 hours before his scan, and that such, okay, so then it goes, that such his CT scan, it talks about that again. In the face of such apparent certainty, Balmer's defense did not present any medical expert offering an alternative explanation, and Balmer was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. Following Balmer's conviction, new lawyers took a look at her case. The National Registry of Exonerations, they sent Philip's brain scan to a radiologist who concluded that the scans revealed a stroke, likely, likely from an underlying infection, Basilian supra. Another radiologist and a forensic pathologist concurred and concluded that Philip's skull fracture was old and could not have resulted from his difficult delivery. Wow. With the help of her new defense team, Balmer's conviction was overturned in November of 2009. At Balmer's second trial, the defense presented 6 expert witnesses who testified that Philip suffered from venous sinus thrombosis or childhood strokes. National Registry of Exonerations, Julie Balmer, the effects associated with the condition closely mirror those of SBS, including brain bleeding and subdural effusions. Balmer was acquitted of all charges at her second trial and was ultimately awarded compensation for her wrongful conviction. Here's another one. Drayton Witt. He was convicted by an Arizona jury in 2002 for the death of his girlfriend's 5-month-old son, Stephen. Stephen's short life had been plagued by medical problems. In the weeks before his death, Stephen exhibited flu-like symptoms and suffered from seizures. Stephen appeared to suffer a seizure in May of 2002 while in Witt's care. Stephen was rushed to the hospital. Okay, let me get past this little sightings, where he arrived in cardiac arrest and later died. A physician from Stephen's treating hospital observed the injuries such as retinal bleeding and concluded that Stephen appeared to be the victim of SBS. An autopsy later revealed the SBS triad, further cementing the preliminary diagnosis. Witt, the last person to have custody of the Stephen, was indicted and subsequently convicted for his murder. The Arizona Justice Project later re-examined Witt's case, enlisting 8 medical experts to review Stephen's injuries. And just as in Balmer's case, the medical experts ruled out SBS and presented an alternative hypothesis for Stephen's death. One such expert suggested a classic picture of venous thrombosis, an alternate overlooked at Witt's trial. And then it gives some, other convictions. It says, see this, see that. So we're going to skip past that. The physician who performed Stephen's autopsy and who testified for the state of Witt's trial signed an affidavit stating that in light of subsequent medical and scientific developments, he could not stand, well, how about that? He's admitting he's wrong. He could not stand by his previous conclusion at trial testimony, and Stephen Witt's death was a homicide, and that he believed Stephen's death was likely the result of natural causes. So he's taking back what he said and said, oh, no, I see it's different. It's natural causes. It makes you wonder. Does the detective talk to the doctor and say, well, it looks like blah 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 blah, and then they come together and they say, well, okay, well, I just think you ought to go ahead and charge them with, SBS. It's easily to see on this CT scan or whatever that's what it was. Yeah, it just sounds to me like they just throw it out there way too much. It just gets it is what is given as the excuse too many times without really looking into it. That's what it seems like. Okay. Whew, let's see. National Registry. Okay, it talks about this. There's a national registry of all the people that have been exonerated and what their original charge was. Okay, so in case you want to look at that, it was granted. She got a new trial, and all charges were later dismissed. Balmer and Witt are just two among many SBX exonerees whose convictions resulted from a failure to consider alternative causes for the symptoms triad, particularly underlying illnesses. The petitioner's situation remarkably similar because Nikki presented with the SBS triad. Plausible alternative medical explanations for her death were overlooked. Nikki experienced several severe medical conditions during her short life, including chronic ear infections and breathing apnea. In the days leading up to her death, Nikki had experienced vomiting, coughing, diarrhea, and a high fever. Upon her hospital admission, the treating doctor observed brain swelling and bleeding on Nikki's CT scan, but quickly dismissed Nikki's recent illness as an explanation in favor of abuse. The failure to investigate Nikki's underlying medical conditions continued following her death and throughout the petitioner's trial. The medical examiner conducting Nikki's autopsy did not investigate her medical history and did not consider a toxicology report and seemingly ignored the presence of, I'm going to say this wrong, guys, the presence of macrophages. It's macrophages, whatever that word is, in Nikki's lung. Oh, it's something that happens in the lungs. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. I think it's vomit in the lungs. I think that's what it is. In the lung tissue that was indicative of a virus. Okay. Expert witnesses at trial also did not consider potential alternative medical causes for Nikki's death. Those sole hypothesis was that Nikki died from a combination of shaking and blunt force trauma. In seeking a new trial, petitioner's attorneys presented experts who found evidence of advanced viral pneumonia. Oh, okay, so that was pneumonia. That's part of the pneumonia, that particular word. I got it now. In Nikki's lungs, and condition that causes hypoxia, which in turn can cause the triads of SBS injuries. Experts also testified that certain prescription drugs Nikki was taking might have contributed to her death. Medical experts explored none of these alternative explanations previously. Instead, they rushed to the judgment due to the presence of the SBS triad, effectively closing the door on an alternative medical explanation that are now gaining acceptance in the medical community. So that one was debunked as well. That debunked belief that shortfalls cannot cause SBS has led to wrongful convictions. And this is a conviction. This is another one where a baby, maybe gets mistakenly dropped. I don't think like Jake Harrow there who intentionally threw that child around. This is different. Another alternative cause of infant injury that has been frequently overlooked is an accidental fall. Classic SBS hypothesis insists that symptoms triads cannot be caused by short distance falls, but instead appears only after severe abuse. Accordingly, once doctors identified injuries consistent with SBS, they were quick to dismiss that an accidental fall could cause such injuries. SBS thus provided prosecutors with a straightforward explanation of the manner of death and evidence of mens rea stemming from the parent or caregiver's supposed frustration or anger. And this is Deborah Turkheimer. Okay, Deborah Turkheimer. In the decades since the inception of SBS hypothesis, biomechanical research has found that, in fact, short falls from as little as 3 feet can cause serious brain injuries and even death in an infant. That makes sense to me. I mean, 3 feet is a long way for a tiny little baby whose skull is not even closed, who has a very soft head, right? This now debunked belief has resulted in the tragic conviction of numerous parents and caregivers who were present when a child experienced a fatal short-distance fall. The sea change in scientific consensus came only after many such defendants had spent years in prison for crimes that did not occur. And it gives some more sightings. One of them is somebody named Baker, affirming grant of habeas relief to a man convicted of murder, relying on almost exclusively the testimony from a medical expert that child's injuries indicated shaken baby syndrome and that the shortfalls cannot cause fatal head injuries. In recent decades, the scientific integrity of such testimony, and it goes dot dot dot, has been undermined. Medical experts now agree, and documentary evidence proves that shortfalls can cause fatal head injuries in children. Here's another one. Kenneth Marsh. He was convicted by a California jury in 1983 of the death of his 2-year-old child. Philip was sentenced to prison for a term of 15 years to life in California. The Innocence Project, okay, give some little sightings here. He'd filed for a habeas before, blah, blah. And anyway, in the summer of 2004, it was denied. So anyway, Marsh had rushed Philip to the hospital after he found him on the floor, severely injured from falling from a couch onto a fireplace hearth. Yes, that would have hurt that child, absolutely. Despite the child's medical history, which included a bleeding disorder, a doctor injected Philip with mannitol, which exasperated his cerebral. Oh Lord. Okay, so he already had a bleeding disorder. They get him to the hospital. A doctor injects this child with something, and it caused it to be worse. Okay, so his brain continued to swell, his blood pressure dropped, and he died the following day. Although police initially treated the incident as an accidental fall, hospital doctors claimed before performing an autopsy that the child could not have suffered traumatic brain swelling and bleeding as a result of a fall. Prosecutors charged Marsh with murder. At the trial, medical experts claimed that the only way the child could have sustained the injuries was through abuse, and that Marsh must have shaken that baby to death. Marsh was incarcerated for nearly 21 years. He described what happened as an accident that turned his life into a living nightmare. I was convicted of a crime that didn't happen and sentenced to life in prison. I was only 28 years old at the time. How can this happen? Yeah, that is a question. How can it happen? In 2002, the habeas petition medical experts submitted that much of this medical evidence used to convict Marsh was inaccurate and that his son could have died from a shortfall in combination with the treating doctor's mannitol injection. I'm sure that's probably not how you say it, but it's spelled Mannitol. Okay. After an independent expert reviewed the evidence, the state asked the court to grant the writ. The court did so, and the state dismissed the charges. California's Innocence Project, which is Kenneth Marsh, blah. Marsh received compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. In 2004, here's another one, guys. 2004, a Colorado jury found Crystal Voss guilty of child abuse for the death of her infant son, Kyron. Alan Pendergrass, this talks about this conviction here, and the exoneration. I'm not going to read that whole thing. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Voss had rushed her limp, unresponsive son to the emergency room, explaining that Kyron had fallen off a friend's shoulders and hit his head on the ground earlier that day. A doctor noted bruises on the child's abdomen and signs of subdural hematoma. At trial, the prosecution's medical experts asserted that the injuries were consistent with SBS and that the child was a victim of violent shaking. Now, how is that causing bruising on the stomach? Please tell me how that works. Echoing the prevailing medical wisdom, the experts he testified that a fall could not have caused that injury. More than a decade later, Voss's lawyers filed a new trial motion. The defense presented expert testimony explaining that the injuries were consistent with a shortfall earlier testimony and upon the literature that is now more than 30 years old. And it talks about this exonerations again. Even the pathologist who performed Kyron's autopsy testified that based on intervening medical advancements, he would have changed the cause of death from homicide to undetermined. See, he still didn't want to admit he was wrong because he's going to only want to go to undetermined. A judge vacated Voss's conviction and ordered a new trial. A month later, the state dismissed the charges in 2002, and Voss received compensation for her wrongful conviction. Xavion Johnson was convicted in 2002 of second-degree murder for the death of his 4-month-old daughter. Johnson was sentenced to prison for 25 years to life and served nearly 17 years before his conviction was reversed. His daughter was taken to the hospital when Johnson and his family noticed her raspy breathing and increasing unresponsiveness. Earlier that day, she had slipped from Johnson's arms and fell while he was bathing her, Johnson's 1-year-old brother had also hit her with a toy. She died the following day. Now, see, that's a little bit questionable because it comes back to the Jake Harl situation where he claims he dropped the baby bathing the baby. I don't know. We weren't there. We really can't say, to be honest with you. The autopsy report showed retinal hemorrhages and subdural hematoma. Although Johnson told investigators about the fall and the toy incident, prosecutors rejected that claim and instead relied on SBS hypothesis to secure his conviction. At trial, 3 prosecution experts testified that the cause of death was multiple injuries to the head and brain as a result of being violently shaken, and that Johnson's claim of the shortfall could not account for those injuries. Testimony by more than a dozen witnesses that Johnson was a gentle and caring father led the jury to believe that he was a good young man, very loving to his girlfriend and their baby girl, and that it would seem horribly out of character for him to murder his baby. And so so how does he get convicted? This is weird. If he's a good father, how does he get convicted? They nevertheless convicted him based on the state's experts' overwhelming medical evidence. One juror later recalled that without that evidence, we certainly would not have convicted Xavion Johnson. How about that? So it only took one expert to change the minds of 12 people? Years later, the Northern California Innocence Project reviewed the case in light of the scientific advancements, soliciting opinions by medical experts, including the original pathologist who testified against Johnson that the child's injuries were consistent with the fall and that Johnson had originally described. So see, even years later, the same medical expert that said, oh no, he shook the baby, has now changed his mind, said, oh no, he fell, or maybe hit in the head by this other child. So what is it that's happening all these years later to make them change their mind? What exactly is it? I want to know. Now I'm going down a different rabbit hole to figure out what the hell is going on here. 2 other prosecution witnesses conceded that, in light of the new scientific evidence, the child's injuries could have resulted from an accidental fall. So after 15 years in prison, he is freed. Okay. A court reversed his murder conviction in 2017, and the state dropped all charges. Johnson recently received compensation from the California Victims' Compensation Board after 17 years in prison. These stories feature remarkable similarities to the petitioner's case. Like the medical experts in those cases, the doctor attending to Nikki's injuries rejected the petitioner's explanation of Nikki's apparent fall out of the bed. Consistent with the prevailing medical consensus, the doctors concluded that it would basically be impossible for a shortfall to cause Nikki's injuries. The petitioner's conviction was secured in part based on this now debunked assumption. Just as the exonerees cases, petitioner's habeas court heard new evidence that shortfalls can cause the exact kind of internal bleeding observed in Nikki. But petitioners remains on death row despite the change in medical consensus that eventually freed Marsh, Voss, Johnson, and many others. Seems unfair, doesn't it? Seems absolutely unfair. The debunked belief that infants would exhibit symptoms immediately after suffering trauma, such that the last caregiver must have inflicted the injuries, has led to wrongful convictions. I do believe that 100%. Another notable fallacy of the SBS hypothesis is the belief that shaken infants will manifest symptoms almost immediately after the abuse. The prevailing assumptions about the tight temporal link between the event and the symptoms meant that SBS diagnosis clearly identified the culpable party, or at least significantly narrowed the suspect pool. Under this view, once doctors diagnose the SBS based on the presence of the symptoms, it remains to identify the last person with the child. So if you were the last person with a child, you're automatically going to be convicted. That does not seem fair at all. But you know what? It goes back to some of the things we always say. It's like our missing children cases. It's like all these cases. Well, the last person with that child was so-and-so. Well, then they need to arrest so-and-so because obviously so-and-so must have done something that was the last person with them. You know? So no, I mean, it may not always be true. Here we go. We have to be careful about blaming somebody without any real evidence. Okay. The prevailing assumptions about so we talked about that already. Let's see. Under these views, once doctors diagnose SBS, based on the presence of the symptoms, all that remains is to identify that person, which we just talked about. The person becomes the suspect, who can then be confidentially pursued. I'm not confidentially, but confidently pursued, and they do always. Whereas the other SBS tenants help to establish the actus reus by holding that the symptoms triad could only result from violent shaking, and mens rea that the shaking sufficient to cause such injuries was necessarily so violent that it could not have been accidental. The belief that a child would immediately display injuries helped to establish the identity of the last person with the child had to be the perpetrator. Scientific research has since shown that this belief, too, is wrong. Medical experts now agree that an infant can experience a lucid interval, a period of time between impact or the event or illness and the manifestation of symptoms during the child can appear symptom free. So it could be hours, it could be minutes, it could be, I don't know, maybe 24 hours, I'm not sure. But because medical experts have long dismissed the concept of lucid intervals, parents and caregivers have been wrongfully prosecuted simply because they were the last person to care for the child. This is a good example of one. Clarence Jones, he's one example. Because he was alone with his son Colin when the child began exhibiting symptoms, Jones immediately became the primary suspect. One of the attending physicians suspected the child abuse based on the child's injuries. The detective confronted Jones. If you didn't cause the injuries to Colin, then who did? Okay. Consistent with that theory, the state argued at trial that because the child exhibited SBS symptoms, he must have been shaken by the last person he was with, Jones. Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, they took over and fought for him. That theory was supported by testimony at the state's That theory was supported by testimony of the state's expert, who rejected the concept of lucid intervals and dated the child's injuries contemporaneously with his collapse and hospital admission, even when the medical records did not necessarily support that conclusion. As the Maryland Court of Special Appeals explained, when it ordered that guilty verdicts set aside, even assuming that shaking could cause the constellation of injuries, the lucid interval hypothesis brings into question the presumption that the last person with the child is medically or legally responsible. Here's another one. Think about this one. Randy Leibich served nearly 15 years in prison after an Illinois jury convicted him of murdering his partner's 2-year-old child. Lots of it. June 8, 2023, Leibich was babysitting Stephen when he started vomiting and began breathing irregularly after choking on food. And the days beforehand, the child's mother had struck him. The defense of the trial argued that Stephen died of complications from the mother's mistreatment. That's what the defense said. But the medical examiner concluded that Stephen's injuries were the result of trauma occurring just hours before the child's admission to the hospital while in Leibich's care, and doctor testified that the injuries were so severe that they had been inflicted a day earlier, the child would have died the day earlier. In post-conviction proceedings that led to Leibich's exoneration, the prosecutor's medical examiners admitted that upon her review of the medical records, she discovered that the child had an acute pancreatitis resulting from injuries prior to the day of the incident, and that given the pathology, it was improbable that the child's collapse appeared to be the result of process that had begun days earlier. Another medical examiner and pathologist likewise submitted affidavits describing considerable consensus that had emerged since Leibel's convictions. The children may have lucid intervals. Okay. Leibel's conviction was vacated in 2018. The state then dismissed the charges after receiving a letter from the medical examiner who had testified against Leibich, in which he stated that the child's death did not occur through the actions taken on blank day, and that the child was admitted to the hospital. And then, talks about the National Registry, blah, blah. I don't want to read all that. So, Randy Leibich, instead, he died from abdominal injuries that were present at least 2 days prior to the hospital admission. Leibich received a certificate of innocence in 2022, and the Illinois Court of Claims awarded him compensation for his wrongful conviction. It goes on and on with these, doesn't it? Again, a petitioner's conviction was based in part in the same faulty assumptions that led to Jones and Leibich's convictions. The pediatricians who testified for Texas opinion that the alleged shaking would have immediately caused Nikki's symptoms, thus clearly indicating to the jury that the petitioner, the last person to care for Nikki, must have been the one who caused her injuries. Like Jones and Leibich, the petitioner was presumed the perpetrator based on the then prevailing view that a child cannot experience lucid intervals following the onset injuries or illnesses. Despite the changes in scientific consensus, petitioner, whose conviction is based on the same flawed theory, still sits on death row. Seems wrong, doesn't it? Wrongful convictions are often predicated on a suspect's inappropriate reactions. This is where it comes down to when you're talking about people. And well, look, that's not how that's not how the mother of a missing child acts. That's not how the mother of a child's accidental death acts. Look at her; she's emotionless. She's flat. Think about that. Just think about that, okay? Finally, another particularly concerning aspect of SBS cases is the extent to which false convictions are predicated on subjective opinions about the appropriateness of the caregiver's reactions to an infant's injury, illness, or death. In numerous SBS cases, treating physicians, police, and prosecutors have testified regarding an accused supposedly inappropriate reaction. Such a reaction is considered an indication of abuse and, coupled with the other fallacies and assumptions described above, it has been invoked into support an SBS diagnosis. For example, in Mississippi, a jury convicted Sabrina Butler in 1990 for the death of her 9-month-old son. June 8, 2023. Butler, then 18, returned home following a short jog to find Walter not breathing and unresponsive. Butler rushed Walter to the hospital, but the attempts to resuscitate him, failed. An autopsy determined that Walter had died of internal injuries and revealed abrasions and bruises and scars on Walter's body. During interrogations, Butler had offered police conflicting explanations regarding Walter's injuries. She referred to a non-existent babysitter and ultimately signed a statement that she had punched Walter in the stomach. Oh my God, that makes me sick. Butler's trial focused heavily on these statements, and she was convicted and sentenced to death. Butler later recounted this questioning and saying, "I was alone with no lawyer or parent with me. I told the officer that I tried to save my baby. He wrote down what I said and threw it into the garbage." What? He said, okay, let me reread this because it's not making sense. "I was alone with no lawyer or parent with me. I told the officer that I tried to save my baby. He wrote down what I said and threw it in the garbage. He yelled at me for 3 hours. No matter what I said, he screamed over and over that I killed my baby. I was terrified. I was put in jail and not allowed to attend Walter's funeral." That's pretty sad. Butler was later granted a new trial at which her defense team presented evidence that Walter's external injuries resulted from Butler's incorrect attempt to perform CPR and that Walter had died from a rare genetic kidney condition. Butler was acquitted and later awarded compensation. Years later, Butler gave birth to a daughter who was diagnosed with and successfully treated for the same genetic kidney disorder. How about that? Sean Brown was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in 2010 for the death of his son, Sean Jr., and later exonerated. The jury heard testimony that while the other family members gathered in Sean Jr.'s hospital room to pray, Brown was watching a television and seemed detached. Authorities monitoring Clarence Jones following Colin's death noted that Jones did not cry. Okay, so we've heard people talk about that too. Well, you're not even upset. You must not care. You must have done it. Expectations about the proper way to report following tragedies are not unique to SBS cases, but caregivers' reactions to infant injury and death feature heavily in SBS cases, particularly where the accused is the parent or family member or of the victim, and such evidence often overshadows other evidence at a trial. Petitioner's case presents a tragic example of this misconception. Petitioner, who has an 8th grade, okay, this is sad now. So this guy has an 8th grade education and is autistic and evidently failed to react to Nikki's death in a way that was satisfactory to the investigators. Hospital staff and authorities noted that petitioner's flat affect when discussing Nikki's injuries and interpreted his reaction as lack of grief over her death. See, that they're just prejudicing right there. Okay. Oh boy, get back to work. Okay, so that's what hospital staff and authorities noted, that he was flat. Okay, and when they discussed stop, things are popping up on my iPad. Okay, so after he had a flat effect when they discussed the injuries. So they decided that, well, he must have done something. Petitioner was diagnosed with autism only after his 2003 conviction, and thus his seemingly inappropriate reaction was unexplained at his trial and taken as an indication of guilty conscience. Because of this misconception and other fallacies associated with SBS, as discussed, petitioner now faces death by lethal injection. And here's the conclusion of all of this. Without the court's intervention, it appears that petitioner will be the first individual executed for an SBS conviction. In light of recent scientific developments debunking essential pillars of the SBS hypothesis, highlighted by the stories of the exonerees above, petitioner's case warrants a more searching review. This court should grant and review, and alternatively, summarily, a reverse. Okay, so that was in June of 2023. So now we're going to go back over here and I'm going to tell you where it is today, because I kind of see the point they're making. I do. So let's look at this. This has been a huge controversy over here in Texas, and where he's at today. Let's see. Okay. Let's go to this. So, because this all, let's go back over here. The Texas Supreme Court has upheld a temporary injunction to allow his testimony before the Texas House Committee on Criminal Jurisprudence. The court later held that the legislative committees cannot issue subpoenas without the intent or interfere with the prisoner's execution date. Since the execution dates are issued through judicial orders, a new execution date has since been requested for Roberson. Ultimately, the committee never heard Roberson's testimony, but others testified, including Roberson's attorney and a juror who supported Roberson in his testimony. So he still is on death row? How does this make sense? Roberson's conviction based on blunt force trauma. At trial, prosecutors argued that Roberson's alleged shaking of his daughter had likely contributed to her death. Some have argued that the use of shaken baby syndrome by prosecutors is junk science, leading to the controversy over the conviction. Since the convictions, Roberson's lawyers argued that his daughter had suffered from pneumonia, which had progressed into sepsis by the time of her death, and unsuccessfully appealed under the Texas law, junk science law, as a defense. Beyond the use of shaken baby syndrome, prosecutors had amassed evidence showing his daughter had suffered a variety of serious injuries that are indicative of abuse and could lead to her death. So he's still on death row. He is still on death row. How does that even make sense knowing what we know right now? Did Texas get it wrong or did Texas get it right? That's what I would like to know. Let's see. They're doing more. Okay, so more researchers. They're doing more research in this field. I'm trying to pick up if there's anything over here on this page that tells us that anything has changed. Okay. So in 2024, here we go. On July 1st of 2024, the trial court in Anderson County approved a death warrant for Roberson, and his execution was scheduled for October 17. Roberson was reportedly the first death row prisoner convicted on the grounds of shaken baby syndrome to have an execution date scheduled. When the scheduling of Roberson's execution date was publicized, his case was heavily debated over whether his murder conviction and death sentence should stand in light of criticisms of shaken baby syndrome. And the lingering concerns of Roberson's alleged innocence were heightened after the announcement of his date. In a final series of legal attempts to escape the death penalty, Roberson and his lawyers appealed to the state's courts to overturn his conviction and brought up undiagnosed autism to seek mercy and argued that it hindered him from having a fair trial. An appeal to the Texas Criminal Court was rejected on September 11th. We just read the brief on that, 2024. There was considerable support coming from lawmakers and law enforcement personnel to stave off his execution. Reverend Brian Warden, a former police officer who investigated Roberson's case and whose testimony helped send Roberson to death row, advocated for the commutation of Roberson's death sentence into a life sentence, stating he believed at this stage that the conviction or sentence should not have happened if proper investigations had been made in this case, especially since Roberson's autism went undiagnosed. A clemency petition signed by 84 lawmakers from 150-member state house best-selling novelist John Grisham and medical experts, death penalty attorneys, and former detectives of the case was submitted to the state pardons board for them to commute his sentence to life without parole. One of the supporters, stating that no crimes had taken place to begin with, and that Texas was about to execute an innocent man. Under Texas state law, the final recourse for inmates awaiting the scheduled execution was to appeal for clemency, and the Texas Board of Pardon and Paroles would decide whether to recommend the clemency, with the governor having the final say. Although it was noted that the governor, Greg Abbott, had rarely granted clemency through his tenure, 2 weeks before he was going to be executed, Roberson also made a personal plea to the governor to spare his life. On October the 8th, 2024, Roberson was granted a hearing of his appeal against the death sentence, but on October the 11th, his appeal was dismissed by the Court of Appeals. On October the 15th, an administrative judge, Alfonso Charles, was the 10th administrative judicial. Okay, listen, this is Judge Alfonso Charles, who was the 10th administrative judicial region presiding judge, rejected the appeal of Roberson's to vacate his death warrant. On that same day, the Texas House of Representatives Committee of Criminal Jurisprudence approved a subpoena to allow Roberson to testify before the Texas House in relation to his case. On October 16th, Texas Parole Board voted to unanimously 6-1 against recommending Roberson's sentence to be commuted or his execution delayed. Abbott can only grant a pardon at the Parole Board's recommendation. The only remaining path to prevent Roberson's execution would be if Abbott awarded a 30-day reprieve to allow litigation to continue. Abbott expressed no intention to do so. Roberson's counsel urged the governor to grant him a reprieve to allow them to more time to prepare this case for continuing to fight for Roberson. Now, this is kind of getting interesting. Simultaneously, as a last resort to evade the death penalty, Roberson appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Texas Attorney General's office had responded that the court proceedings at this cause, that Nikki Curtis's death was inconsistent with a shortfall from a bed or complications from a virus. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal before the scheduled timing of Roberson's execution. Roberson was slated to be put to death via lethal injection at 6 p.m. on October the 17th at Huntsville. However, a Travis County judge issued an order to temporarily block this execution. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals subsequently overturned the stay after the prosecution appealed and ordered an execution to move forward. However, the Supreme Court of Texas intervened and temporarily halted this execution after Roberson's attorney and the state lawmakers filed a last-second appeal for stay. Roberson was scheduled to testify before this House committee on October 21st, where the lawmakers were to consider testimony when determining whether amendments should be made to the Texas law governing the junk science. He was going to do this in person. Let's see. It wouldn't be safe to bring death row inmates to the camp. What? That's bullshit right there. That's bullshit. On November 15th, 2024, the Texas Supreme Court ruled that the state lawmakers had exceeded their power when they called Roberson to testify before a House committee. A new execution date can be set, but the court also said lawmakers could still call Roberson to testify and that the executive branch would have to accommodate such a request. On December the 2nd, 2024, a judge who signed Roberson's death warrant, Judge Deborah Oaks Evans, voluntarily recused herself from the case. She didn't want to deal with it anymore. So, 2025 rocks along. On June 17, 2025, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton lodged a second motion to seek a new execution date for Roberson. After the prosecution of the case was transferred to his office at the request of District Attorney Allison Mitchell. On July 16th, State District Judge Austin Reeve Jackson scheduled the execution for October 16th. On September 26th, it was reported that Roberson waived his right for petition for clemency. Instead, he would channel his last attention and efforts into seeking a new trial for his murder conviction. On October the 9th, 2025, the Court of Criminal Appeals issued an emergency stay of execution. The court stay sends the matter back to the trial court to review the science based on the state's 2013 junk science law. Boy, that's a lot of stuff. It drew a lot of media attention, and the appellate process and statements made by politicians have generated extensive media coverage. Novelist John Grisham is writing about this case in a nonfiction book that's titled Shaken. Well, now we need to read the book, don't we? The Rush to Execute an Innocent Man, it's being published this summer. It's the summer 2026. So the best I can figure out is he's still alive, still waiting to be executed, and I guess we'll just see what happens. So I think that's a very interesting case, and I can see where there's Both sides. I can look at both sides. Well, I mean, she had this kind of injury, she had that kind of injury. Did she fall? Did she not fall? I'm not sure. I don't know. But I do know one thing. I think before he is executed, they do need to actually, I think he should actually get a new trial based on the evidence that shaken baby syndrome is junk science. I do believe that. But it's been a long time, and I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll stay on top of it. We'll just kind of, hey, Colt, how you doing? What? Hey, what's up? Good to see you, Colt. Let me tell you who Colt 45 is. Colt 45 is part of our sponsor, worldswave.com. Welcome in, Colt. We're so happy to see you. Good to see you. I was just reading about an appeals court and a decision about did Texas get it wrong on the death penalty for Robert Roberson over shaken baby syndrome. So we're going to have to wait and see what happens. It's still out there. It's still pending. There's still no they don't have they haven't issued a new death date, but he doesn't have a new trial date either. So anyway, I'm going to get off of here and go do something else right now. I just wanted to talk about that for a minute because it is a hot topic over here in Texas. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see. We'll just have to see what's going to happen. He's already 59 years old now. So these just like the thing I talked about this morning. Sorry, my dog's gonna bark. These death convictions that you give these people, and they wait and wait and wait, just like the yogurt shop murders. They wait and wait and wait. They finally get a new trial. They finally get the new information comes out. They find out it's not them. They're still waiting, waiting, waiting. They're not in prison, but they're over still trying to live a life that's hell. And how long does it take to actually get exonerated? Years. And you don't get paid in Texas unless you've got a full exoneration. Just because the DA's office says, well, we don't think they're guilty anymore, we're going to dismiss the case. You still don't get paid. You have to have a full exoneration in the state of Texas. So anyway, we'll find something else to talk about later. I just wanted to cover that this morning. I hope you all have a wonderful day. My dog's going to bark. I'm going to have to get off of here. Hang on a second. Hang on. He is just not going to stop. Somebody's walking down a road and they're not allowed to. That's what his deal is. So anyway, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks for coming by. As always, please like, subscribe, and share. If you get a chance, please hit that thumbs up. If you like us, if you don't, that's okay too. Take us out of here, Sprinkle Donut.
And don't forget to hug your babies.
That's right. Life is short. It's even shorter with them. I'll talk to you guys later. Have a good afternoon. Take care of yourself. Bye, guys.